What if the confession everyone is talking about was never meant to be believed at all? That question alone has set social media on fire. Screenshots, voice clips, anonymous posts, bold headlines that spread faster than facts ever could. A single sentence, allegedly spoken by Rob Reiner's son, Nick Reiner, has been repeated so many times that it now feels real to millions of people who have never seen a verified source. I was paid to do this. 14 words. 14 words that, if true, would change everything, and if false, would still destroy lives. So before we go any further, let me ask you something directly. Have you noticed how fast your brain fills in the gaps when the story feels shocking enough? Because this story didn't begin with evidence. It began with emotion, fear, outrage, and a hunger for meaning in a narrative that feels almost too dark to ignore. And that's exactly why it matters right now. Not because we know what happened, but because so many people think they do. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. In the last few days, claims have exploded online alleging a horrifying chain of events involving Rob Reiner, his wife Michelle, and their son Nick. Posts claim violence, confessions, arrests, motives tied to money. Some even claim official charges and sealed statements. The story has been retold so many times, with such confidence, that it now circulates as if it were settled fact. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Stories don't become true because they're repeated. They become powerful, and power, in the wrong hands, can be weaponized. This is not a video about confirming guilt. This is not a video about defending anyone. This is a video about pulling the story apart, slowly, carefully, and asking the questions most people are too emotional to ask. Because once a narrative like this takes hold, the damage is already done. Even if every claim collapses tomorrow, the internet never forgets what it once believed. So how did we get here? It started quietly, not with a press conference, not with a police statement, but with a post, then another, then a screenshot of what was described as a leaked confession, then a voice note, then a headline summarizing everything in the most dramatic way possible. Each version added something new. Each retelling sharpened the knife. And with every share, the story drifted further away from anything verifiable. But the human brain doesn't wait for verification. It looks for patterns, for villains, for motives that make horror easier to digest. And money is always the easiest motive to sell. I was paid to do this. It sounds cinematic, clean, final, like the closing line of a crime documentary. It explains everything in one stroke. And that's exactly why it should make you uncomfortable. Real life is messy. Real crimes are chaotic. Real confessions rarely sound like movie dialogue. So why does this one feel written? Before we even examine who allegedly said it, we need to understand why that sentence alone captured the internet's imagination. Because it offers relief. Relief from uncertainty. Relief from complexity. Relief from having to sit with unanswered questions. If someone was paid, then the horror becomes transactional, controlled, understandable. There's a villain, a motive, a reason. And once a reason exists, people stop asking harder questions. But what if that relief is the trap? What if the sentence was never a confession at all, but a hook? Let's zoom out for a moment. Rob Reiner is not just a public figure. He's a symbol, a cultural presence spanning decades. When someone like that becomes the center of a shocking claim, the emotional impact multiplies. The audience doesn't just react to the alleged crime. They react to the collapse of an image they thought they understood. And when family is involved, the reaction turns feral. Because betrayal stories cut deeper than stranger crimes ever could. A son, a guest house, a quiet estate, a single night that allegedly changes everything. You can feel how perfectly this narrative fits the internet's appetite, can't you? Contains setting, familiar names, implied secrets, and just enough alleged detail to feel real without being provable. But here's something most people didn't stop to consider. If this were as clear-cut as it's being presented, why is the story being told almost entirely through anonymous sources, recycled captions, and secondhand claims? Why do the details shift depending on who's telling it? Why do some versions include arrests, while others stop just short of that claim? Why do some posts say confirmed, while others quietly say reports claim? Those small linguistic differences matter more than you think, because they reveal hesitation. And hesitation is where truth either emerges or disappears. Let's talk about the alleged confession again. Confessions, real ones, are rarely short. They're messy, fragmented, full of qualifiers, fear, rationalization, silence. People don't usually announce their guilt like a headline, especially not with a line that neatly introduces motive. So when a sentence appears that feels too clean, too quotable, too perfectly shaped for virality, it raises a critical question. Who benefits from this being believed? Not who committed what, not who is innocent or guilty, but who gains power, attention, clicks, or control by pushing this version of events. Because belief is currency online, and outrage is the fastest way to mint it. You've probably noticed how quickly comments escalate, how fast people demand punishment, how confidently strangers declare they've seen enough. Seen what exactly? A screenshot? A caption? A paraphrased quote from an unnamed source? At what point did speculation quietly become conviction? And more importantly, why did it feel so easy? There's a reason stories like this spread faster than corrections ever will. They tap into something deeply human, the desire for closure, for a clear ending, for a moral resolution that tells us who to blame and when to stop thinking. But the truth rarely gives us that luxury. Sometimes the most responsible thing we can do is slow down, even when the story begs us not to. Especially when it begs us not to. Because slowing down is dangerous to a viral narrative. It exposes cracks, contradictions, missing pieces. And this story, once you start examining it carefully, has more missing pieces than most people realize. For example, have you noticed how rarely original sources are cited? How often posts reference other posts instead of primary information? How the same phrases appear across different accounts, word for word? That's not organic storytelling. That's replication. And replication doesn't require truth. It only requires engagement. Which brings us to the most uncomfortable possibility of all. What if the most shocking part of this story isn't what allegedly happened, but how easily we accepted the version we were given? What if the real danger isn't a single alleged confession, but the speed at which millions of people decided it explained everything? Because once that decision is made, evidence becomes optional. Contradictions are ignored. Silence is treated as confirmation, and doubt is framed as defense. And that's when the internet stops being an audience and starts acting like a jury. But juries are supposed to see evidence. They're supposed to hear context. They're supposed to understand that certainty without proof is not justice, it's performance. So here's what we're going to do in this series. We're not going to tell you what to believe. We're not going to declare guilt or innocence. We're going to examine the claims, one by one, where they came from, how they spread, what doesn't add up, and what questions no one wants to ask because the answers might be inconvenient. And yes, that includes the alleged confession, especially that. Because when we slow down and look closely at how that sentence appeared, how it was framed, and how it was repeated, something unsettling begins to emerge. Something that suggests this story may not be unfolding the way we were told. And the first crack appears right at the beginning, with the moment this claim first surfaced and the account that pushed it into the spotlight. Because once you see how that happened, everything else starts to look very different. It didn't break like real news usually does. There was no official statement, no press briefing, no confirmed source stepping forward to attach their name to the claim. Instead, the story appeared the way modern scandals almost always do now, quietly, casually, and then all at once. One post. That's how it began. A single upload, shared late at night, framed as if it were filling in a gap the public supposedly didn't know yet. The wording was careful, not definitive. Just enough certainty to sound informed. Just enough ambiguity to avoid responsibility. Sources are saying. That phrase should always make you pause. Because sources can mean anyone. An insider, a friend of a friend, or a stranger typing from a burner account with nothing to lose. But the post didn't stay alone for long. Within minutes, it was reposted, then screenshotted, then summarized by accounts that didn't even link back to the original. Each version shaved off a little nuance. Each retelling added a little confidence. By the time it hit larger platforms, the sentence had transformed. Sources are saying became reports confirm, and reports confirm quickly became it has been confirmed. That's how certainty is manufactured, not through proof, but through repetition. Ask yourself something honestly. How many times do you need to see a claim before it feels true? Once? Twice? 10 times in a row on your feed? The human brain is wired to trust familiarity. We mistake frequency for verification. And the people who understand this best know exactly how to use it. The account that posted the original claim didn't look suspicious at first glance. It had followers. It posted regularly. It spoke with confidence about celebrity news, scandals, behind-the-scenes stories. The kind of account people already follow because they want to feel like they're getting information before everyone else. But when you slow down and examine it, patterns emerge. The posts rarely cited primary sources. Headlines were often sensational. Corrections, when they happened at all, were buried or deleted. This wasn't journalism. It was amplification. And amplification doesn't care if something is true, only if it spreads. What's even more interesting is what happened next. Within hours, dozens of other accounts began echoing the same claim. Not paraphrasing it, not questioning it, repeating it almost word for word. The same sentence structure. The same dramatic pacing. Even the same punctuation. That doesn't happen by accident. That's coordination or copying. Either way, it tells us something critical. The story didn't evolve organically. It was replicated. And replication creates the illusion of consensus. Suddenly, anyone scrolling their feed saw the same narrative from multiple angles. Different usernames. Different profile pictures. Same core message. Nick Reiner. Confession. Paid. By the time mainstream audiences encountered the story, it felt established. Like everyone already knew. Like questioning it would make you look naive or behind. And that's the pressure point. Nobody wants to be the last person to catch up. Nobody wants to look like they're defending the wrong side. So people share first and think later. If they think at all. But here's where things get even stranger. When researchers and skeptics tried to trace the story backward. To find the original source of the alleged confession, they hit a wall. No court document. No police report. No audio with verifiable metadata. No named witness willing to stand behind the claim. Just layers of reposts referencing each other in a closed loop. It's like shouting into a canyon and calling the echo a crowd. And yet, despite the lack of verification, the story kept growing. Why? Because it had all the right ingredients. A famous name. A shocking accusation. A family betrayal angle. And a quote that sounds final enough to end debate. I was paid to do this. It doesn't invite questions. It shuts them down. And that's exactly why it spread. But there's something else people missed in the rush to share. Timing. The post didn't appear during peak news hours. It appeared late, when moderation is lighter, fact-checking slower, and emotional reaction stronger. When people are tired, scrolling, less critical. That's not coincidence. Late-night posts often act like test balloons. If they gain traction overnight, they're amplified in the morning. If they don't, they disappear without consequences. And this one gained traction. By sunrise, reaction videos were already being uploaded. Some creators read the post out loud on camera, adding shocked expressions, dramatic pauses, and their own speculation. Others summarized it in short clips, cutting out every disclaimer and uncertainty. And with every retelling, the story hardened. What began as an unverified claim started to feel like a timeline. What began as speculation started to sound like a case file. This is how narratives solidify before facts arrive. But there was another detail buried in the early spread that almost no one noticed. The wording of the alleged confession changed slightly depending on who was sharing it. Some versions said, "I was paid to do this." Others said, "I was paid to kill them." Some said, "He admitted he was paid." Others added motives that weren't present in earlier posts. That inconsistency matters. Real statements, especially ones as explosive as confessions, don't mutate this quickly unless they're being paraphrased or invented. Ask yourself this. If you had access to a genuine confession, wouldn't you quote it exactly? Wouldn't you preserve the wording? Wouldn't accuracy matter more than drama? Unless accuracy was never the point. Another red flag appeared when people began asking basic questions in comment sections. Where did this come from? Who confirmed it? Is there a source? Those comments were often ignored. Or worse, attacked. People asking for proof were accused of defending the accused, of being heartless, of not believing victims. That tactic is effective because it reframes skepticism as cruelty. But skepticism is not cruelty. It's responsibility. And anyone trying to shut down questions instead of answering them should make you nervous. Then came the escalation. Accounts that had initially posted vague claims began adding new details. Arrests, charges, alleged statements from family members. Each update framed as if it were a continuation of an already confirmed story. But when pressed, none of these additions came with documentation. No links, no official quotes, no verifiable timestamps. Just confidence. And confidence is persuasive, especially when it's loud. What's fascinating is how fast people stopped asking whether the story was true and started debating what it meant. Was it about money? Was it about resentment? Was it about inheritance? Was it about secrets? Those conversations assume the premise is real. And once that happens, the original claim no longer needs proof. It becomes the foundation everything else is built on. This is the moment when a rumor stops being a rumor and becomes a narrative. And narratives are incredibly difficult to undo. Even if every claim were disproven tomorrow, many people would still say, well, something must have happened. Because doubt, once planted, doesn't need evidence to survive. Now let's talk about the most dangerous part of this phase, the speed. From the first post to full-blown belief took less than 24 hours. In that time, no official clarification had been issued. No investigation details had been released. No authoritative source had confirmed anything. But the internet didn't wait. It never does. And that should terrify you, not just for this case, but for anyone who might be next. Because if a story like this can be constructed, amplified, and believed this quickly, the truth becomes almost irrelevant. All it takes is the right framing, the right timing, and a sentence that feels like closure. But there's one more detail about that original post that changes how we should see it. The account that shared it edited the caption several times in the first hour. Early versions were cautious. Later versions were bold. Then parts were removed entirely. Why edit if you're certain? Why revise if you're reporting facts? Unless the goal wasn't accuracy, but optimization. Testing what wording gets the most reaction. Which phrasing travels farthest. Which version triggers the strongest emotional response. And once the most effective version is found, that's the one that spreads. That's not reporting. That's engineering. And it raises a chilling possibility. What if the story didn't spread because it was true? What if it spread because it was designed to? Because when you look closely at how it appeared, how it mutated, and how aggressively it was defended despite the lack of evidence, one thing becomes clear. This wasn't an accident. And the deeper you look into the language of the alleged confession itself, the more questions it raises. Questions that have nothing to do with guilt or innocence, and everything to do with authenticity. Because when experts began analyzing that sentence, the structure, the phrasing, the psychology behind it, they noticed something deeply unsettling. Something that suggests it may not sound like a real confession at all. And once you hear why, you may never read that line the same way again. The first clue came from the phrasing itself. I was paid to do this. For simple words. Yet the experts noticed it immediately. Real confessions rarely sound so tidy. They stumble over words, hesitate, contradict themselves. They're emotional, messy, human. But this sentence was almost sterile, perfectly formed, as if written for dramatic effect. A forensic linguist examining it noted something remarkable. The structure suggested planning, not panic. Planning, not guilt. Not the spontaneous admission of someone overwhelmed by fear or remorse. Ask yourself, how often do people confess crimes in neat, one-sentence sound bites? Rarely, if ever. Confessions are usually fragmented, full of uhs, I thinks, and contradictory statements. They reveal the confusion and terror of someone caught in the act. But this sentence reads like a line in a true crime documentary, designed to shock and grab attention. This observation alone doesn't prove anything, but it's a red flag. Then there's the issue of timing. The alleged confession wasn't leaked by authorities. It wasn't recorded during an interrogation. It appeared online in a post, unverified, during the late hours when fact-checking is slowest. Late-night posts have a particular advantage. They reach people when critical thinking is dulled by fatigue, when judgment is clouded, when emotion trumps analysis. And it went viral quickly. Within hours, people were quoting it verbatim, sharing it widely, treating it like verified fact. That's how narratives are constructed. Slowly at first, then rapidly. One person posts a claim. Another shares it. Another amplifies it. And suddenly millions believe it. It's not just a sentence. It's a contagion. Social media researchers studying similar cases found that the most effective viral rumors have a few things in common. Clarity, a concise, dramatic statement that's easy to repeat. Emotional punch, words that provoke anger, fear, or shock. Ambiguity, enough uncertainty to encourage speculation, but not enough to prevent sharing. Authority hints, references to unnamed sources, reports, or witnesses. I was paid to do this ticks all four boxes. And that explains why millions of people accepted it almost immediately. Not because they had proof, but because it felt credible. It fits the template for online virality perfectly. Meanwhile, the story around the Reiner family added fuel to the fire. Alleged tensions between family members, rumors of disputes, the dramatic setting of a wealthy estate. All details designed to increase engagement. People love conflict, especially in families that are public and seemingly perfect. It's almost irresistible to speculate about what happens behind closed doors. But here's the key. While the story circulated as fact, almost nothing was verified. No official arrest records. No police statements confirming the confession. No family member willing to speak on the record. Yet the narrative solidified as if those details existed. How? Through repetition and selective reporting. Some accounts even altered the alleged quote. "I was paid to do this" became "I was paid to kill them," or "he admitted he was paid." Each version added a layer of drama. Each version gave the story more bite. And viewers often didn't notice the subtle shifts. They only remembered the shock. And then the speculation began. Why would someone be paid? Who would pay them? What motive could justify such a claim? This is where the story shifted from a viral post to a full-blown moral narrative. People began constructing a storyline: son, betrayal, payment, crime, justice, all neatly packaged. The narrative had everything humans crave: clarity, villainy, and drama. The problem? None of it had been confirmed. Even the idea that Nick Reiner lived in the guest house and might have had access to the alleged events doesn't confirm anything. Location does not equal culpability. Circumstantial details alone can be misleading, especially when presented in an emotionally charged narrative. Then came the third layer of complexity: the role of secondary accounts. Accounts reposting the original post didn't cite sources. They added confirmations that didn't exist. Some included additional details, fabricated or exaggerated, to increase engagement. Each version drifted further from any possible truth. By the time mainstream audiences encountered the story, it felt established. And once the public starts assuming facts, the narrative becomes almost impossible to retract. Ask yourself, how many times have you seen headlines repeated across multiple platforms until you assumed they were true? 1, 2, 10 times? That's enough to create the illusion of verification. And once that illusion takes hold, corrections are almost irrelevant. Here's where the psychology gets darker. When people are presented with shocking information about someone they recognize, especially a public figure, critical thinking diminishes. Fear, curiosity, and outrage replace skepticism. It's not just that people want to believe, they need to. They want a narrative that makes sense emotionally, even if it doesn't make sense factually. And the alleged confession? It fulfills that need perfectly. But not all reactions were passive. Some skeptics started asking questions online. Where's the proof? Who confirmed it? Are there court documents? The response to those questions was telling. Some were ignored. Others were dismissed aggressively, with insinuations that doubting the story made you heartless or disloyal. Silence or attack replaced evidence. And that's a classic tactic. Reframe skepticism as immorality, and the narrative spreads unchallenged. Meanwhile, the content creators who amplified the story began adding layers of interpretation. Arrests, charges, motives, statements from unnamed family members. Each addition was framed as if it were factual, yet none of it was verifiable. None cited sources that could be independently checked. But here's the critical point. Confidence is persuasive. Loud confidence even more so. People rarely stop to ask if loudness equals truth. Then came the timing of edits to the original post. The account that first shared the claim revised captions multiple times within an hour. Early versions were cautious. Later versions were bold. Words were added. Words were removed. Each edit seemed designed to maximize emotional impact and shareability. This wasn't reporting. It was optimization. And that raises a chilling question. What if the story spread was not accidental? What if every repost, every edit, every amplified statement was deliberately engineered to create a viral narrative, regardless of truth? The answer matters, because the consequence of viral acceptance is permanent. Even if every claim collapses tomorrow, the damage remains. Reputations are tarnished. Trust is eroded. Memories are rewritten. And the deeper you dig, the more unsettling it becomes. Experts analyzing the alleged confession noted patterns that mimic scripted dialogue, not spontaneous human speech. That's not proof of fabrication, but it's a warning sign. Combined with the rapid, coordinated spread and absence of verification, it paints a picture of a story engineered for virality. By the end of the first 24 hours, the narrative was locked. Millions believed it. Conversations assumed its truth, and any remaining doubt was marginalized. This is where the story becomes more dangerous than the original claim itself. Because once the public assumes guilt, they stop demanding evidence. They start constructing motive. They start spreading interpretations. And suddenly, reality doesn't matter, only perception. And that brings us to the most critical insight of all. The alleged confession, the viral posts, the edited captions, the repeated amplification, all of it demonstrates one thing. The story that everyone believes may be as engineered as any Hollywood script. And if that's true, then the next part of the story, what happens when experts, skeptics, and authorities start looking closely, is where the real revelations begin. Because once you strip away the amplification, the repetition, and the dramatization, you're left with questions no one seems willing to answer. And the first of those questions will change everything. The detail that almost no one noticed was subtle, almost invisible in the chaos of reposts and headlines. It wasn't the wording of the alleged confession. It wasn't the claim about payment. It wasn't even the timing of the post. It was something buried deeper, in the way the earliest versions of the story reference sources. According to someone familiar with the matter, reports indicate, unnamed sources say. Those three phrases, repeated endlessly across accounts, are the linguistic equivalent of smoke without fire. They imply authority. They suggest insider knowledge. But they provide nothing tangible. No name, no date, no corroborating document, just a shadow of credibility. And here's why that matters. When people read sources say, they subconsciously translate it as truth. They imagine a police officer, a family insider, a journalist on the inside track. But the statement could mean anyone. A friend of a friend, an anonymous tipster, even a fabricated account with a keyboard and an agenda. That ambiguity is incredibly powerful. It creates just enough uncertainty to be credible and just enough clarity to be shareable. Then the post started to evolve. The ambiguous, someone familiar, morphed into police confirm in certain versions. Reports indicate became official sources say. With each repetition, the implied authority escalated, and the story gained momentum. This is a classic viral pattern, not just for celebrity scandals, but for political claims, financial rumors, and high-profile controversies. Start with ambiguity, amplify with repetition, escalate the authority, and watch the public accept the narrative without verification. Meanwhile, skeptics started to notice inconsistencies. Some versions of the story claimed Nick Reiner lived in the guest house at the time. Others didn't mention a location at all. Some claimed the bodies were discovered by a sister. Others made no mention of her involvement. Details shifted depending on who was retelling the story. Yet the core, "I was paid to do this" line remained. Why? Because that line was the hook. Everything else, setting, characters, context, could mutate. But the sentence itself needed to stay intact for the story to retain its viral power. Here's where psychology comes into play. Humans have a remarkable tendency to fill in gaps when presented with a narrative that feels complete emotionally, but is incomplete factually. We subconsciously add motives, imagine sequences of events, and construct the why in our minds. That's why stories like this are so irresistible. They demand participation. And the more dramatic the story, the more likely people are to fill in those blanks with worst-case assumptions. And worst-case assumptions they did. Almost immediately, Social media users began speculating about money, inheritance disputes, resentment, and revenge. Each speculation added another layer of drama to the already explosive claim. It was as if the story had grown tentacles, wrapping around everyone who touched it. But there's another angle that almost nobody noticed. Even as the posts were being shared, the earliest versions were being quietly edited. Words were added. Words were removed. Some phrases were rephrased to increase emotional punch. Certain posts deleted entirely after they failed to gain traction. This isn't reporting. This is optimization. It's the process of engineering a story for virality, where the content is continuously refined until it produces maximum shock, engagement, and emotional reaction. Accuracy is irrelevant. The goal is amplification. And it worked. Within hours, the story had traveled far beyond the original audience. Creators, influencers, and media commentators picked it up. Some read the post verbatim. Others created dramatic video essays. Each added their own speculation, further cementing the narrative in public consciousness. But the most revealing aspect came from the experts who analyzed the language. Linguists, psychologists, and media analysts noted that the sentence structure of the alleged confession was unlike natural speech under stress. It lacked the hesitation, self-correction, and fragmentation typical of someone admitting to a serious act. It read instead like a prepared statement, designed for clarity and drama, rather than spontaneous disclosure. Combine that observation with the rapid, coordinated amplification, the repeated claims of authority, and the absence of verifiable sources, and the pattern becomes undeniable. The story was not just spreading, it was being engineered. And once the public accepted it, the consequences escalated. People began treating speculation as fact. The narrative became a moral framework. Villain, motive, betrayal. Online debates assumed guilt. Outrage spread faster than any corrections could arrive. And for those who questioned the story, silence or ridicule became the only response. This is how digital narratives can destroy lives, not through confirmed facts, but through the illusion of certainty. And in this story, the most critical element was still the alleged confession itself. Because that forward sentence, repeated across thousands of posts, functioned as the anchor. It gave the narrative a sense of finality. It allowed audiences to stop asking questions and start assigning blame. And the more it was shared, the more real it seemed, even without verification. But here's where the next twist appears. When analysts traced the earliest appearances of the post, they discovered a pattern that had been overlooked. The accounts that first circulated the alleged confession were not random. They were linked by timing, phrasing, and follower networks that suggest coordinated amplification. Not just accidental virality. Not just social momentum. Coordination. And that changes everything. Because if the story was coordinated, then the purpose may not have been truth at all. The story could have been designed to provoke outrage, drive clicks, and manipulate perception, while hiding the lack of evidence behind repetition and implied authority. In other words, the alleged confession may be less about actual events and more about controlling the narrative. And that's the point where the investigation stops being about Nick Reiner, or the Reiner family, or even the content of the claim. It becomes about how information, verified or unverified, can be weaponized in the digital age. The speed, precision, and psychological hooks embedded in this story demonstrate a truth many people ignore. In the era of social media, perception often outweighs reality. Belief spreads faster than facts. Outrage spreads faster than verification. And once the public believes, it rarely unlearns. The cracks appeared in the most unexpected place, the inconsistencies within the story itself. At first glance, the alleged confession and surrounding claims seemed cohesive. I was paid to do this. Son in the guest house. Family tensions. Financial motives. All neatly aligned. But when researchers began tracking every version of the story, a pattern of contradictions emerged. Some posts claimed the bodies were discovered by the Reiner's daughter Romy. Others didn't mention her at all. Some included details about a dangerous family member, without specifying who. Some accounts implied Nick acted alone. Others insinuated accomplices. Each retelling shifted context, rearranged emphasis, and subtly altered facts. Yet the central sentence of the confession remained untouched. That's important. The story could mutate in any direction, but the hook, the line designed to shock, remained intact. The emotional core was preserved, while the surrounding details became a moving target. Psychologists call this a cognitive anchor. When presented with a compelling hook, the human brain fills in the rest, even if the details are inconsistent or missing. It's why people accepted the story despite glaring contradictions. They weren't reading for facts, they were reading for drama. And then came the role of social proof. Once a critical mass of accounts began reposting the story, nearly identical in wording and structure, the illusion of verification became irresistible. Millions of users saw the claim repeated, creating a false sense of consensus. If everyone else seems to believe it, why question it? This is how perception morphs into apparent fact. The alleged confession was now more than words. It was a cultural artifact, a shared narrative constructed by repetition and amplification rather than evidence. Meanwhile, media outlets began to reference online reports in their coverage. Headlines subtly shifted from cautious phrasing to statements implying confirmation. Some phrases like "according to reports" were dropped entirely in favor of declarative assertions. And once a traditional outlet presented the story as semi-authoritative, the public perception solidified further. But there was a deeper anomaly in the early circulation. The timing of the posts revealed subtle coordination. The original claim surfaced late at night, when moderation is minimal and emotional responses are heightened. Then, within minutes of the initial post, accounts with overlapping follower networks began echoing it. Each repetition increased engagement metrics, which triggered algorithmic amplification across platforms. By the next morning, the claim had reached audiences that would never have seen the original post. This was not organic virality. It was engineered momentum. And the linguistic pattern of the alleged confession added another layer of intrigue. Experts noticed the phrasing was unusually concise, composed in a style resembling scripted dialogue. Real confessions, especially in high-stress situations, are fragmented, hesitant, and emotionally raw. They contain self-corrections, contradictions, and pauses. This sentence, neat, declarative, and emotionally punchy, resembled media-ready sound bites more than human speech. Combine that with the amplification strategy, the timing of edits, and the deliberate repetition, and the pattern emerges. The story was designed to spread. Accuracy was secondary, virality was primary. But it gets more disturbing when we examine audience reactions. Once the claim circulated widely, people stopped asking whether it was true. Instead, they speculated on motive. Was it about money, resentment, inheritance, betrayal? These discussions assumed guilt as a baseline. Facts became optional, interpretation became primary, and those interpretations spread faster than the original post. They became memes, debate threads, and emotional touchpoints. People began defending their beliefs fiercely, often dismissing or attacking anyone who requested verification. Skepticism was framed as immorality. Questioning the story became socially risky. This is the power of engineered narratives. Once the audience assumes the truth of a claim, the story no longer needs proof. Belief itself becomes the proof. Then came the first observable evidence of cracks in the narrative. Researchers who examined the earliest posts noticed minor edits. Captions were changed. Words were added or removed. Some posts were quietly deleted after failing to gain traction. Others were re-uploaded with subtle tweaks designed to maximize emotional engagement. These adjustments suggest intentional optimization. The story was being refined in real time, not reported as fact. And that refinement is what gave the story staying power. Because every iteration reinforced the central hook while adjusting the supporting details to maintain suspense. The public consumed the narrative as if it were coherent, even though the foundation was shifting beneath them. At this point, it wasn't just a story about an alleged confession. It was an experiment in information dynamics. How quickly a narrative can spread, how audiences internalize it, and how authority can be implied without being substantiated. The alleged confession functioned as a cognitive anchor. The surrounding inconsistencies were glossed over. Readers filled in gaps emotionally rather than rationally. And the story became more than an accusation. It became a shared experience, a piece of collective drama that required participation, speculation, and moral judgment. And yet, amidst the amplification, timing, edits, and linguistic anomalies, the original claim was never verified. No official record, no police statement, no documented evidence, only repeated assertions. But here's the most unsettling part. The public had already accepted the narrative. Doubt no longer mattered. Questions about motive, timing, and context were sidelined. The story had become self-sustaining, fed by repetition and confirmation bias. Because once someone looked beyond the hook, beyond the repetition, and beyond the emotional pull, a series of questions appeared that had no answers. Who actually made the original claim? Who verified it? Who edited it, amplified it, or coordinated its spread? And most importantly, how much of the public acceptance was driven by engineered perception rather than fact? These questions don't just challenge the story. They challenge the entire framework through which we consume information online. And the first answer to these questions would come from an unexpected source, a detail buried so deep in the early circulation of the claim that almost no one noticed it. A detail that would force a complete reevaluation of the story. And that is where the investigation takes its next, shocking turn. The hidden clue appeared in the most unlikely of places, the metadata of the earliest posts. At first glance, metadata seems mundane: timestamps, edit histories, device types. But when analysts began piecing together the original spread of the alleged confession, subtle patterns emerged that almost no one noticed. The first posts didn't just appear late at night. They were systematically staggered across accounts with overlapping followers. This isn't something accidental. The timing suggested orchestration. Each post reinforced the previous one, maximizing engagement while evading moderation and fact-checking. It was as if someone had choreographed a chain reaction, one post lighting the fuse for the next. And it wasn't just timing. The device types, geolocations, and IP patterns of early posts hinted at coordinated activity. Multiple accounts were posting from different devices, but within the same network clusters. Analysts described it as a classic amplification strategy, the kind used by marketing campaigns, political operatives, and organized disinformation networks. In other words, the story wasn't merely viral. It was engineered. That discovery immediately reframed the alleged confession. Until now, the public had assumed spontaneity, a shocking truth revealed by a distressed individual. But the metadata suggested manipulation. If the posts were coordinated, the confession itself could have been constructed as part of a deliberate campaign, designed for maximum emotional impact. And this is where psychology intensifies the danger. Humans are wired to respond to patterns and narratives. We see a sequence of posts, all saying roughly the same thing, and we interpret it as truth. The repetition itself functions as a heuristic. If everyone else says it's real, it must be. Confirmation bias kicks in, and critical thinking is sidelined. Meanwhile, the content itself reinforces engagement. I was paid to do this. For words, simple, explosive, emotionally charged. It provides closure in a way that real confessions rarely do. Humans crave closure. We want villains, motives, and resolutions. And that sentence, repeated across carefully timed posts, delivered exactly that. But the real danger emerges when amplification meets assumption. Once the public assumes the truth of the statement, interpretation spreads faster than verification. People start constructing motives, imagining details, debating scenarios, all based on the presumption that the central claim is factual. The alleged confession becomes a cognitive anchor, and every subsequent piece of speculation is measured against it. And yet, there were cracks. Some early observers noticed discrepancies, variations in phrasing across posts, differences in who was said to have discovered events, conflicting accounts of locations and timelines. Each inconsistency was a warning signal. The story wasn't as cohesive as it appeared. But here's the critical insight. The public often ignores inconsistencies when the emotional hook is strong. We fill gaps with assumptions. We smooth over contradictions in our minds. And we share the story as truth because it feels true, not because it has been verified. Then analysts noticed something even more telling: the edits to the earliest posts. Changes weren't random. Words were added to increase drama. Clauses emphasizing danger or motive were inserted. Phrases implying authority were emphasized or moved. Some posts were deleted entirely when they underperformed, only to reappear with optimized language. This is classic virality engineering. It's a deliberate process of refining narrative to maximize emotional impact and shareability. Accuracy is secondary. The story is the product, and engagement is the currency. And it worked. Within hours, the narrative had propagated across social media platforms, reaching audiences that would never have seen the original post. The alleged confession had achieved the status of accepted fact, even in the absence of verification. What's remarkable is how quickly the story bypassed skepticism. Users who normally question sources accepted the narrative almost immediately. Why? Because the orchestration and repetition created a sense of consensus, while the emotional resonance of the hook bypassed rational scrutiny. This is the power of engineered narratives. Once belief takes root, corrections are nearly irrelevant. Even when facts emerge, they struggle to overwrite the perception established by repetition and emotional impact. And the alleged confession's phrasing plays a key role. Linguistic experts noted it doesn't resemble spontaneous speech under duress. It's concise, declarative, and structured for clarity and drama. Real confessions rarely exhibit this combination. They are hesitant, fragmented, and emotionally raw. Combine that with the strategic timing, edits, and coordinated amplification, and a pattern emerges. The confession itself may have been crafted for virality, rather than being a genuine, spontaneous admission. And that raises an unsettling possibility. If the confession is engineered, then the story the public has accepted may be less about reality and more about perception. It's a narrative constructed to provoke outrage, attract attention, and engage audiences, independent of any verifiable events. The implications are enormous. Because in this case, as in many viral narratives, perception drives action. People assign blame, debate motives, speculate endlessly, and the alleged confession anchors all of it, even in the absence of evidence. But the next revelation goes even further. Once analysts examined the sequence of early posts alongside subsequent amplification, they discovered the first deliberate manipulation, a strategic change that transformed ambiguity into apparent certainty. And it's that transformation, from uncertainty to unquestioned narrative, that would become the pivotal moment in understanding how this story spread, why it was believed, and what it reveals about how information operates in the digital age. The pivotal moment came in the subtle shift from ambiguity to apparent authority. In the earliest versions of the alleged confession, the posts were cautious. They used language like sources say and reports indicate. The tone implied insider knowledge but carefully avoided outright assertion. Ambiguity was the key. It allowed people to speculate without committing the poster to verification. But then the posts evolved. Within hours, phrases like sources say were replaced with it has been confirmed or official reports state. The cautious hedge vanished, leaving readers with the impression that the confession was a verified fact. This is the critical mechanism of narrative manipulation. Take a claim, test it in its ambiguous form, measure engagement, and then escalate confidence once the audience has invested emotionally. And the timing of that escalation was no accident. Analysts noted that the most assertive posts appeared during peak engagement windows, morning in North America and late evening in Europe, when algorithms are most likely to amplify content based on early interaction. Every like, comment, and share increased visibility, creating a feedback loop. The more people interacted, the more the platform's algorithms promoted the posts, and the faster the story spread. Now consider the psychological impact on the audience. Initially, ambiguity encourages participation. Readers ask, speculate, and discuss. Once confidence is introduced, however, the story transitions from speculation to accepted truth in the minds of millions. This transition is seamless because the emotional hook, the alleged confession, has already anchored the narrative. People have invested attention and outrage. They want the story to be real. Cognitive bias does the rest. And it didn't stop at phrasing. Visual cues were added to reinforce authority. Screenshots mimicking official documents. Edited images implying police involvement. Videos reciting the alleged confession with dramatic voiceover. Each layer added another veneer of legitimacy. By the time audiences saw these posts, The story had transformed from rumor into something that looked official. Meanwhile, small inconsistencies. The changing details about who discovered the bodies, the alleged location of the events, the involvement of family members, were ignored or rationalized. Human brains are remarkably good at filling in gaps when a narrative feels emotionally complete. Contradictions become footnotes. Suspicion becomes skepticism of the doubter, not the story itself. At the same time, the network dynamics amplified the effect. Accounts that shared the initial ambiguous posts were closely connected to influencers and creators with large audiences. Each repost triggered another, often without any critical evaluation. By the end of the first 24 hours, millions had seen the story framed as near certain fact, even though no primary source had been cited. The engineering of the narrative was subtle but masterful. Start with ambiguity, encourage speculation, escalate confidence, and reinforce with visual and linguistic authority. Repeat across multiple accounts and time zones. The audience does the rest. And yet, as carefully as this narrative was constructed, the first cracks began to appear. A few observant analysts noticed discrepancies in timestamps and post histories. Some posts had been deleted or re-uploaded with slight edits. Some claimed sources that didn't exist. Others misattributed statements to family members or law enforcement. Every inconsistency hinted at the underlying manipulation. But by the time these cracks were identified, the story had already passed the point of no return. The emotional impact was entrenched. Millions of people believed, shared, and speculated. Fact checks, corrections, and clarifications would struggle to penetrate the cognitive anchor created by the alleged confession. Here is the most unsettling aspect. The confession itself, the 4 words, "I was paid to do this," had become a cultural touchstone. Its presence in the narrative allowed people to construct elaborate motives and scenarios around it. It provided closure and villainy. It simplified complexity, and it did so with minimal evidence. This is why the alleged confession mattered far more than the verifiable facts. In a social media-driven ecosystem, perception often outweighs reality. And once belief solidifies, the narrative becomes self-sustaining. But the final revelation in this early stage of the story exposed an even more disquieting truth. When analysts compared the flow of posts with engagement metrics, they discovered deliberate reinforcement loops. High-performing posts were reposted, edited slightly for maximum emotional punch, and amplified again. Less effective posts were deleted or buried. The story was continuously optimized in real time. Every edit, every repost, every adjustment was designed to increase reach and impact. In other words, the narrative was alive. It evolved according to the reactions of its audience. Engagement wasn't just a byproduct. It was a feedback mechanism guiding the construction of the story. And that's when the first truly unnerving question emerged. If the narrative can be engineered and optimized so effectively, how much of what we accept as truth in viral stories is actually constructed for us to believe? Because in this case, the alleged confession may have been less about a real statement and more about how a story spreads, how it manipulates perception, and how belief is manufactured at scale. And that brings us to the next phase of the investigation, where we move beyond amplification and examine the consequences. The alleged confession, the engineered virality, and the cognitive anchoring had already done their work. But the human and societal impact, the reactions, accusations, and moral judgments, were only beginning to unfold. The consequences of the engineered narrative became apparent almost immediately. Once the alleged confession went viral, people stopped asking whether it was true and began asking what it meant. The narrative had shifted from uncertainty to moral judgment, from speculation to outrage. Social media feeds filled with accusations, debates, and imagined motives, all based on a statement whose authenticity had never been verified. This is where the real-world impact begins. Family members, whether involved or not, were suddenly thrust into the public eye. The Reiner household, already under intense scrutiny, became the stage for global speculation. People dissected every detail. Who lived where, who was seen with whom, and what past disagreements might suggest about motive. Every fact, verified or unverified, was interpreted through the lens of the viral confession. Meanwhile, public discourse spiraled. Influencers, commentators, and online personalities jumped on the narrative, amplifying it further. Some offered expert analysis, speculating about psychological motivations. Others created dramatic reenactments, treating the confession as fact. Each new interpretation strengthened the story, cementing it in collective perception. And here's the insidious part. Those consuming the content rarely questioned it. Repetition and emotional resonance replaced verification. People became advocates for a story they had never confirmed. They defended its plausibility, criticized doubters, and even constructed elaborate theories to explain gaps in the narrative. Cognitive biases had taken hold. Confirmation bias, emotional reasoning, and social proof all worked together to make the story feel undeniably real. But the viral narrative did more than shape perception. It created consequences. Online harassment and threats emerged. Individuals associated with the Reiner family, some public figures, some private individuals, faced scrutiny, accusations, and in some cases, attacks. Rumors about accomplices, motives, and cover-ups spread with minimal evidence, fueled by the emotional potency of the alleged confession. At the same time, media organizations began reporting on the viral content itself, sometimes without distinguishing between verified information and online speculation. Headlines shifted from reports say to Nick Reiner confesses in mere hours. The line between rumor and fact blurred for mainstream audiences, and that blur had tangible effects. It influenced public opinion, shaped social discourse, and put immense pressure on authorities. Investigators, if involved, now faced the challenge of managing not just the facts, but the perception of guilt created by social amplification. Meanwhile, the alleged confession, 4 words, repeated endlessly, became a cultural touchstone. Memes, discussion threads, reaction videos, and social commentary all revolved around it. Even people who had never seen the original post engaged with it through secondary exposure. Its reach extended beyond the initial platform, embedding itself in public consciousness. Here's where the psychological stakes become clear. Humans respond more strongly to emotionally charged narratives than to raw facts. The alleged confession was simple, definitive, and morally compelling. It offered closure, identified a villain, and provided a clear narrative arc. This emotional clarity is powerful. It allows audiences to suspend critical thinking in favor of engagement. And that suspension of critical thinking fueled the story's momentum. As more people accepted the narrative, they reinforced it for others, creating a feedback loop. Outrage was contagious, speculation was viral, and belief became almost inevitable. But the human impact didn't stop online. Offline, the story shaped perceptions of the Reiner family. Conversations, workplace discussions, and personal interactions began referencing the alleged confession as if it were fact. Even those attempting to verify the story were influenced by the sheer volume and consistency of online narratives. And yet, amidst all this, inconsistencies persisted. Analysts tracking the earliest posts noticed edits, deleted posts, and minor changes in phrasing. Some accounts fabricated sources or misattributed statements. Discrepancies in timelines, locations, and the involvement of family members were ignored by the broader public, overshadowed by the emotional impact of the central hook. This is a hallmark of engineered narratives. The emotional anchor obscures contradictions. The hook, in this case, "I was paid to do this," becomes a lens through which all other details are interpreted, no matter how inconsistent or unverified. And as the story continued to unfold, experts began to question the underlying mechanisms of its spread. Why did certain posts get traction while others faded? Why did edits increase engagement? Why did emotional phrasing consistently outperform neutral reporting? The answers pointed to a sophisticated understanding of social media dynamics. The story wasn't just viral, it was optimized for impact. Timing, repetition, phrasing, and visual cues all worked together to maximize reach, emotional engagement, and perceived credibility. This optimization had consequences beyond mere clicks. It shaped public discourse, influenced perceptions of guilt, and forced everyone, authorities, family members, and the audience alike, to operate within a narrative constructed largely online. And yet, despite the scale of the narrative, verification remained elusive. No official confession was confirmed. No primary source had come forward. No document authenticated the alleged statement. Everything rested on repetition, amplification, and audience assumption. Which brings us to a chilling realization. In a connected digital ecosystem, the perception of truth can be manufactured independently of fact. A narrative can achieve widespread acceptance, influence real-world behavior, and shape public opinion, all before verification occurs, and sometimes even without it ever occurring. And that sets the stage for the next revelation, the moment when the engineered narrative collides with reality, and the consequences of perception over fact become unavoidable. The collision between narrative and reality came quietly at first, almost imperceptibly, but its effects were immediate and far-reaching. As the alleged confession spread, law enforcement and legal analysts began noticing an unusual pattern. Inquiries, tips, and reports that referenced the viral claim rather than verified evidence. People who had seen the story online were calling authorities with information based solely on social media posts. Some even claimed personal knowledge, despite having no connection to the events. The line between rumor and actionable evidence had begun to blur. Meanwhile, the Reiner family was